feel free to turn on your screens during this moment of introduction so we can all say hello. It's really nice to see you all. Hi, Adam.
I see a lot of familiar
and Bruce.
Some familiar names from outside of the Bay Area. Shout out to the Society for Photographic Education people, it looks like. And everybody else, of course. It's nice to see our social networks at work, though. Should we get started as we have people coming in?
Sure, whatever works for you.
Yeah, cool. Okay. If you can see my tiny little square, my name is Erica Gentry. I'm a board member and the programming committee chair at the San Francisco Camerawork. And we, that is Christina Senni and I here representing Camerawork, are very excited to introduce to you Ellen Lake. Ellen Lake will be the first person to do a presentation within our new Artist Toolkit Series. That is, we bring tools for you, artists in the community who are interested in furthering their careers. This is called Grant Writing for Artists Part 1. And I saw this great presentation with Ellen several years ago, and I was very inspired by it, and it really helped me to go on and receive a few grants, which I was very grateful for. And so I think this will be very useful to you. It's foundational, so whether you are a new grant writer or a seasoned grant writer, we hope you pick up something interesting. Before I introduce Ellen, San Francisco Camerawork would like to acknowledge that we sit on the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ohlone peoples, who are the original inhabitants of San Francisco. And Ellen Lake, who we're going to spotlight here in a moment, co-directs Kala Art Institute in Berkeley, where she is the artistic director. She oversees grant writing and working with the Kala board, and is a founding director on fundraising initiatives. And she helps to create and produce this thriving organization. If you've never been to Kala, it's in Berkeley on San Pablo Avenue. It's a beautiful space. I found out recently they have a black and white darkroom in addition to their renowned printmaking facilities and gallery. So without further ado, Christina, is there anything you'd like to add before we get started with Ellen? You want to go over the ground rules for the Zoom call?
Yeah, I just wanted to welcome everyone again to tonight's presentation. We will be opening things up so that you guys can ask questions and it can be an open dialogue. So please feel free to leave questions and comments in the chat that you have for Ellen. And tonight's event is being recorded. So if you don't want your image to appear in our recording, then you can hit the stop video button at the bottom of your screen. And we will keep everyone muted while Ellen is speaking so that we can hear her. But with that, I'll hand it over to Ellen to get started. Thank you, Ellen, for being here.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks so much to Christina, Erica, and Sunny, and everyone at SF Camerawork for having me here this evening to kick off the Artist Toolkit Series. And thanks for everyone for coming. Just to get the chat box going, if everyone can just type in the chat box where you're here from. I'm just curious where people are tuning in from. So wherever you may be from, just type it in the chat. San Francisco, Chicago, Reno, Oakland, San Francisco, Alameda, Dallas. This is great. San Francisco, Vancouver. This makes me really happy. Thank you so much for coming, and I have as much to learn from you all as you have to learn from me. So feel free as the presentation's going to put questions in the chat box, and then we have two different sessions where I'll take down my screen share and we'll talk and ask questions and do some of that. So right now I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started. It's so nice to see you at Mojave Desert, Philadelphia, Cambridge. This is fantastic. Okay, give me a minute and I'll pull up my presentation. And thanks for having me. Okay, can everyone see that okay? Thumbs up? Great. So let me make sure I have my toggle. Okay, So I am here to talk about grant writing and sort of set up the evening. We have an hour and a half, and we might finish a few minutes early, but to go over introduction and goals, and then to get right into grant writing strategies. And we're going to look at a couple of case studies, and they're California based. It didn't occur to me that people would be tuning in from all over. So the two case studies we're going to look at are the Creative Work Fund and also the California Arts Council. So I hope it's helpful for everyone else as well. And then I'll take down the screen share, and we'll have time for to stretch and for conversation. And then we'll go right into more tips for grant writing, some mistakes to avoid, discussion. And then I have a number of resources that will hopefully be helpful for artists everywhere. So that's what we have planned. So I'm going to just start with an introduction. I'm an artist and also an arts administrator. And so I kind of have an eclectic art practice. I'm really into collections and collecting. So you'll see my postcard imagery throughout this presentation, my postcard collection. And I'm also really interested in the evolution of technology and kind of how image making has changed over the years. And then doing public art projects. I have a project that I did for about 5 years called Bench Projects. In North Oakland, where we took the Advertise Here bus bench spaces and did kind of a community art gallery that local artists in North Oakland could show their work, which was a really fun project. So I have written a lot of grants as an artist, but I'm also here as an arts administrator. As Erica mentioned, I'm the co-director of COLA, and I just want to say that Mayumi Hamanaka is the artistic and co-director. It does more of the artistic side of things, but together we manage COLA, and we'll talk more about that at the end of the presentations from artist opportunities that we have at COLA Art Institute. So those are the two perspectives I bring, arts administrator and artist, and I've been applying for grants for what feels like forever, but I've been at COLA since 2008. And so apply for a lot of organization grants for arts education, exhibitions, artist residencies, public art, all sorts of special initiatives. So that'll come into it as well. All right, so the goals we have today are just to go through the grant writing process from start to finish, to talk about what makes a solid grant proposal, number of tips and strategies, the fun section, which are mistakes to avoid, and then we'll end with a number of resources for everyone. Okay, so this is pretty basic, but what are grants and why do I want one? The grants and fellowships, hold on, I'm gonna do something. Okay, oh, now I can see the chat box too. The grants, fellowships, and artist residencies are all geared towards providing you with resources. And so in most cases, this means funding, but not always. Sometimes you're awarded like time, space, equipment, and things like that with artist residencies. So when you apply for a grant, you're asking the provider to help you complete a project. You're seeking personal and professional growth, and sometimes you're doing community-oriented projects. The tricky part is you're one of many out there asking for the same grant applications. And so today we'll talk strategies and tips to make your application successful. Grant opportunities for artists are often project-focused, community-based, collaborative, sometimes have an educational component, and often you have to be connected or funded through a nonprofit organization, or sometimes grants require fiscal sponsorship. So where to start? You want to assess what exactly you want your funds for, and are you really ready to proceed with the project? And the preparation is doing your research to support your request and finding out who might fund your request. So this is a special shout out to Lauren Davies, my former colleague at COLA, who, this is obviously a pre-pandemic picture at the Berkeley Bowl West of her researching her grants. And she used to give a presentation at COLA about how to successfully fund an artist residency, and was nice enough to turn over that presentation to me, and that evolved over the years. And so I wanted to give a special shout out and appreciation to Lauren Davies, who's now in Cleveland, Ohio. So the best thing you can do when researching grants is to really carefully review the grant website and look at the work of the artists who've been previously awarded the grant. I find this the most helpful step, actually. And then figuring out if there's a general fit with your work in terms of the media that they've funded, the content of the grant, and the general career level of the selected artists. So the first case study we're going to look at today is the Creative Work Fund, which is a Bay Area grant for $45,000. It's a 2-year grant. And the Creative Work Fund invites artists and nonprofit organizations to create new artworks through collaborations. It celebrates the role of artists as problem solver and the making of art as a profound contribution to intellectual inquiry and to the strengthening of communities. Artists are encouraged to collaborate with nonprofit organizations of all kinds. So the important thing here is you don't have to collaborate with an art nonprofit. You can collaborate with, someone who's working in food justice, environmental organizations, homeless advocacy, all sorts of kinds of nonprofits. So, what's great about this grant is it's $45,000 for 2 years, and the bulk of it goes to the artist. I think the nonprofit can take like 15, maybe 20% of the grant, but the bulk of it really goes to the artist. So when I was sort of going through that research phase, I said, okay, who are recent grantees there? And I just pulled out these 2 projects. And I am assuming that Lindsay Tully is the lead artist working with the artist collective Bonanza, collaborating with artists from Creativity Explored, which is in San Francisco, to create fashion and textile pieces for an exhibition and runway show at the Museum of Crafted Design. So you'll notice that they have the lead artist, they have a collective of artists they're working with, they have the nonprofit collaborator, and then another community partner. And then the image on the right is Eugenia Chan collaborating with the Paul Drescher Ensemble and Shadowlight Productions to create a new musical shadow theater work, Heterotopia. And so something to note about Creative Work Fund, it's for any media. It can be craft, dance, theater, visual arts, media arts, animation, social practice. I mean, basically, it's a really great grant possibility for a lot of different artists. And so for that grant, the first step to take is to find your collaborating nonprofit, and you work together on a letter of inquiry or a letter of intent. Sometimes that's called a request for proposals, an RFP, and it can be the first step of some grant proposals. You have to get past the sort of LOI stage or the RFP stage, and you'll be invited to write a full proposal. Sometimes that's nice because the LOI or RFP is a much shorter process, and then you can really work out the details in the full proposal. And occasionally funders will, if you make it past the first stage, will actually fund you to write the full proposal, like the Kenneth Rainin Foundation does that sometimes, and a few other organizations. So just using Creative Work Fund as an example, we just did this application at Kala Art Institute a couple of weeks ago, and so it's very fresh in my mind. And the whole letter of intent had a 10,500 character count limit. And I want to say that's somewhere between 2 and 3 pages. And then all of these different sections that you had to include. So we packed a lot into our 10,500 character count. So we had to talk about the project description, and we had to talk about Kala was the partnering nonprofit. So we talked about what Kala does, and then we talked about the quality of the lead artist's work. We applied with an artist named Rodney Ewing, and then we talked about how the lead artist's work relates to the project. And then we had to talk about, well, why pick, as an artist, as a lead artist, why pick that nonprofit to partner with? And for us as a nonprofit, why invest the time and relationship of 2 years to work with this particular artist? And so that you can talk more about the rationale for why you're collaborating, and then how you'll reach artists and the other communities that you'll serve. And then finally, there's a budget. And the total of the grant is $45,000. And I've never met a funder who discourages you from applying for the full amount. So unless your project really is scaled back, I often just recommend applying for the full amount that they give, that a funder gives. So in terms of the budget for the Creative Work Fund, this is what it looks like. You put your income in, and that can include in our case, we have no earned revenue that was attached with the project, but the donated revenue includes the Creative Work Fund ask itself. So the $45,000 that is pending or being requested is included in the income. And then we put an additional $15,000 from another project fund. So our total income was $60,000. And then we went through the expenses. And in this case, they had clear guidelines, and now I can't remember if the organization could take maximum of 15% or 20%, but you want to make sure that you're reading their guidelines carefully and following them. And the bulk of the money of this fund does go directly towards artist salaries for the 2-year period, which is also really nice. And then finally, the last step for this LOI, or this letter of intent, was an optional 2-page artist CV or resume. I see a question. Are the character limits strict? I'm just going to stop for 1 second. Are the character limits strict? Completely. What happens if you hand in something with too many characters? They won't let you actually upload the document. So you can't save your document online until you get rid of your characters. So it'll say like you need to get rid of 8 characters or 27 characters or 350 characters, and you have to keep shortening it and getting it down to the character count. And so what we always do is we create our document in Google Docs so we can share it with everyone, and we really shrink the character counts down there instead of working directly into the grant portal. And so that helps a lot. But still, you think you have it down to 10,500 characters, you put it in the portal and you're 4 characters over. And so you have to, find where you can cut. And the average rate per hour for the artist is a really good question. We usually do something between $40 and $60 an hour when we write grants, sometimes $35 to $60 an hour. I would imagine it depends on where you're living and what the going rate for artists would be. So the last step was this optional 2-page artist CV or resume, which we did include for the lead artist. And it just reminded me that to get in the good habit of just keeping your CV or your resume up to date. And so I recommend having just a longer one that you're always updating, and then also a 2-page version that's kind of ready to go if a grant opportunity arises. So that sort of takes us to the end of the Creative Work Fund grant. If for many of these, and I can't remember if this is true for the Creative Work Fund, if you can't find an actual nonprofit, sometimes you have the option of finding a fiscal sponsor. So a nonprofit arts organization that will act as a fiscal sponsor. So this comes up for, I don't know, 25% of the grants, where you either need to be connected to a nonprofit or a fiscal sponsor. And so this has happened to me as an artist, where I've found a grant I wanted to apply to, and then I've actually had to find a fiscal sponsor, and it's not that easy. I think for bench projects, Pro Arts was my fiscal sponsor, and then way in the past, I'd gone to BAVAC for a fiscal sponsorship. At Kala Art Institute, where I work, we have a handful of projects that we'll take under for fiscal sponsorship. About 5 to 10 a year. So depending on where you live, if you're in Berkeley, you might go to Kala, you could check the Berkeley Art Center. If you're in San Francisco, you might go to Intersection for the Arts, or San Francisco Film Society, and so forth. So that's kind of a little bit about fiscal sponsorship, which is basically what happens is the grant goes to the organization. The organization charges an administrative fee. At Kala, we charge 10%, and then we send the project funds to the artist. So the Creative Work Fund's letter of intent has a lot of these elements that a full proposal will also have. So grant proposals for individual artists each have their own specific criteria, but they all include very similar elements. A project description. Why are you seeking funding? What are your project goals? This is a big one. Who's your audience and what community is to be served? What are the objectives and the outcomes of your project? What activities are you going to do to achieve those outcomes, and who will implement those activities? What's your timeline? How will you evaluate your project? And then what's your budget that's directly linked to the described project? An artist statement when requested, a work sample, images, documentation of work, a CV, and letters of support. Those are all elements that are in most grants that I apply to. Sonia. Sonia just asked if the Creative Work Fund is specific, or can the nonprofit also be in another state? The Creative Work Fund is not only California specific, but it's also specific for certain Bay Area counties. Bay Area and a little bit beyond. Like I think Sonoma County is okay. You'll have to check the website, but it's a grant that specifically covers like 6 or 7 counties in and around the Bay Area. This is just a grant proposal tip thrown in, which is to practice writing and speaking about your work. So to receive a grant, you'll have to discuss things like your process, your motivation, your short-term goals, your long-term goals. And so it's just good practice to get to write an artist statement for each project you do. You can do it journaling, you could do it on your website. That just makes you more aware of your own biases and tendencies, and look for speaking opportunities to get more comfortable describing your work to people. So now we're going to do our second case study. And again, I just wanted to say this is California specific, so hopefully people from other states have similar funding resources where they are. But for the first time in many, many years, the California Arts Council has reopened their individual artist fellowship. And so this means this is a grant where as an artist, you don't need a nonprofit and you don't need a fiscal sponsor. You can just set up your account on their Smart Simple portal and apply. So the Individual Artist Fellowship Program intends to recognize, uplift, and celebrate California artists. Fellowships will support artists from a broad spectrum of artistic practices, backgrounds, geographies, and communities, whose work addresses themes, including but not limited to race, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. In doing so, the California Arts Council will showcase the centrality of artist leadership in generating social impact and the evolution of our traditional and contemporary cultures. The program supports artists 18 years or older at key moments in their careers, elevating their capacity for continued contribution to the field in our state. So the interesting thing about this artist fellowship is this 3-tiered system. So for emerging artists, you can apply for the $5,000 award, and that's for artists who have between 2 and 4 years of artistic practice. And then for artists with between 4 and 10 years of artistic practice, you can apply for the $10,000 award. And for the Legacy Artist Fellows with 10 years or more of artistic practice, you can apply for the $50,000 per award. And these are all due April 1st. So if you're inspired after this workshop and you live in California, I recommend logging in, looking at the guidelines, and starting to see what you're going to need for this application. So I logged into the portal to see what this application entailed. This is the Artist Fellowship. So you need to have 700 words to describe how you came to be an artist, your traditions or artistic practice, challenges and accomplishments, and long-term aspirations of your work. So that's the first part of the narrative. The next most important part is your artistic work samples. And I thought this was interesting too. So if you were applying for the emerging category, you just needed to do 2 to 3 artistic work samples, and then 4 to 6 work samples for the established category, and 8 to 10 work samples for legacy artists. So I thought that was kind of interesting. As always, follow their work sample directions carefully. In this case, they really say, please do not send additional or extra work samples. They will not be reviewed. And they tell you how to use the file names, like use brief and specific file names. And then you can also submit your support materials, which would be your resume, your CV, and 2 other additional supporting documents like press materials, flyers, brochures, newsletters, and other marketing pieces. And they ask that it be in the past 2 years. And I try to stick to that the best I can, but sometimes it's something from 3 years ago. I'm not completely strict about that. So let's see. Okay, so then you still have more questions to fill out for this application. So next they want to know, how will this fellowship impact you personally, artistically, and professionally? And they also want to know what the community impact will be. What relationships and engagement do you have with a local and/or regional organization and initiatives? So I would take this to mean that it's not so much for you to be in your own studio and focusing on your artistic practice and not sharing it with the community, but it seems like something that involves a relationship with the community. And then they want a letter of support or a testimonial. Applicants must provide a written statement from a key stakeholder, partner, or community member that substantiates the artist's practice and impact in their community. So even though this is due April 1st, I had somebody ask me this week for this letter of support or testimonial, which I was very impressed by because I tend to not follow these tips and sometimes do things very last minute. And so this is a great time to log in and explore what you need for this grant. And then this grant's really interested in the social impact. So share how your artistic practice, processes, and activities generate positive social impact on a local, regional, and/or statewide basis, addressing themes such as race, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. So that's sort of the two case samples we're going to look at. And I just wanted to talk about it from an artist perspective. And this is from an artist, Christine Wang Yap, who is sort of bicoastal both in New York and also does projects in the Bay Area. And this is how she talks about grant writing. Stages of grant writing: intrigue, eagerness, excitement, mind-numbing agony, compliance, lost in spreadsheets, competitiveness, obsession, revising until you can't possibly revise, then resignation and submittal as life before app becomes not just much more desirable, but more pertinent and much, much more likely. And one thing I love about Christine is she's full transparency. Every year she has a blog where she puts on exactly how many grants she applied for and how many she got or didn't get. So you can go to her blog, which is listed up here. And I looked up, okay, what did she do in 2019, 2020? She applied to 13 applications, 6 residencies in New York, 3 exhibitions in New York, a couple residencies in the Bay Area, and a couple grants and awards. And she talks about 23% of those made it to a second round or semifinalist or finalist, but it sounded like all of those this year ended up in no's. So she sort of reflects on that and talks about that at least 1 or 2 successful applications usually happen for the past 6 years for her. So garnering 0 successful applications is a surprise. The sting of these no's is ameliorated by a more recent yes, as well as invitations which arose from existing partnerships or work. So I just thought this was really interesting transparency. So I went back a year just to look at what she applied for in 2018, 2019. And she received notification for 6 of 8 of her applications, and she received 1 residency and 1 studio program. So 2/6 of what she had heard from, or 33%. She also visualizes her grants in another way, which can be helpful. Some of these grants have very, very low odds. So she looks at the Harpo Foundation, and all of those, you know, the red marks of the 10 grants out of 1,300 applications, this visually went down for pages, and I just cut and paste a little bit of it. And then, you know, another example was the Center for Crafts Craft Research Fund Artist Fellowship, which was 2 fellowships for 127 applications. So all of this isn't to depress any one of us. It's just the reality of all of these application processes. And I guess we're going to focus today on, in order to get these grants, we have to apply. You'll never catch a fish without going fishing. So it's really just keeping at it, setting goals, and keeping things in perspective. So I'm going to stop the share so we can talk and answer a few questions before we get going with the next section. So for looking at those 2 case studies, does anybody have any questions? You can put it in the chat or unmute yourself. See if I missed anything too.
There was a question about from Emma. Emma said for the CAC grant, like when you're kind of in between emerging and established, do you err on the side of applying for the lower dollar grant or the higher dollar grant? That's kind of a hard thing to answer, but if you have any insight.
That's such a good question. Those categories are so arbitrary. The friend who I gave a shout out to, Lauren, who sort of, I built this presentation on one of her presentations, was laughing how she was like an emerging artist for like 20 years, depending on the grant. She's like, oh, I just got an emerging artist grant. She'd been a practicing artist for, you know, decades. So I would have to say, like, You know, if you have really strong work samples that fit the middle category and you want to apply for the 10,000, go for it. I mean, you have to really feel where you feel the most comfortable.
Another great question, of course, we have people from all different places. Do you have any favorite websites as resources for grant announcements, national grant announcements?
I like Creative Capital for both grants and for residencies. Do other people have places that they can put in the chat that they like? How do you know if you're established or emerging? NIFA is a good suggestion to look for grants. In terms of state grants, I'm really curious. You know, you have your city grants, you have your county grants, and you have your state grants. And I actually think that all three of those places are great places to start your grant writing, because for some of those grants, like county or city, they can be slightly less competitive in that, maybe 40 people apply and 10 people get funded. And so they can be a good way to start funding your projects. These are lots of good questions. I'm going to go back up a little bit just to Sonia about established or emerging. Sonia, did you feel like I answered that? It's pretty arbitrary. Years since graduation. I don't think it's specifically by years since graduation, since people's art careers kind of go through phases. Some people be really active for 4 years and take a break for 10 years and start making again. And in that case, I think that they're emerging or re-emerging. So I don't think it's necessarily from when you graduated from school.
I just wondered how there's no rule, right? It's like it's really up to each person to decide by themselves.
Yeah, I mean, in the case of the California Arts Council, I would think that those like $50,000 legacy grants would be very, very challenging to get. So I would probably not suggest that category. But the other two categories, whether you are 70 people getting them or 50 people getting them, they're still going to be competitive because it's for the whole state of California. But hopefully each time you apply for one of these grants, you're working on your material, you can, recycle some of the content for other opportunities, you're getting your best work samples together and all of that. So it's, I always like to think of it as like good practice to apply for these things. And certainly the only way you will get them is by applying for them. Yes, I would. Hi, Emily. So nice to see some people I know. I would say that not to get too hung up on emerging versus established and go with what feels like the right place for you. These are great suggestions for resources too. Will we get a copy of the chat after?
Yeah, I'll send around the recording for tonight and also a link, or list of resources that'll be hyperlinked.
These are great. Okay, I see a question about, can you speak about writing less than the character count? The less is more theory, or is it best to write as close to the amount stated? That's a really good question. I would not feel obligated to hit that character count limit. Most people who are reading grants are reading, multiples at a time. So if you can really succinctly get your point across, I think that that's much preferred. As long as you have enough details to that they can sink their teeth into it and really understand your artwork, I don't think you need to fill the character count. Should I reach out to previous grant winners directly? Also, should I reach out to the grantor prior to submitting, email or call? Those are great questions. I probably wouldn't feel comfortable necessarily reaching out to previous grant winners directly, but some people I would imagine would. I mean, people's information can be so public. I do feel comfortable emailing the grantor prior to submitting because they're there to provide webinars, answer questions. Sometimes, I've had people who've read the whole proposal at the city of Oakland long ago, told you how to change it to make it better, and then had you resubmit it. Not everybody will do that, but some people are very generous with their time in helping you be as successful as you can be in writing and working on that grant. So I don't think there's any harm in in emailing that funder. I certainly wouldn't burden them, but I don't think there's any harm, and it can be helpful to reach out to people in advance.
One funder suggested I apply in a different category because the chances were better.
Interesting. Did it work out?
It did.
That's
Please
great.
No, you can ask.
What, say that again?
You never know. It's okay to ask.
Yeah, I think so too. What do you feel, Erica, about reaching out to a previous grant winner?
I would say not unless you know them or they offer it in your community. Like I know somebody that won the Guggenheim and was very generous and shared their application, but it was with people that they knew.
Yeah, that sounds like a good response.
I think the
I'm
better
gonna
idea is to sign up for part 2 of Ellen's workshop and
in just a minute we'll go back to the tips and mistakes to avoid. Let me look at this last question. In the past, some grants won't count online shows as serious exhibits, but now that we're in a pandemic and a lot of shows were canceled or moved online, are online shows and lectures considered valid on the CV? I definitely think so. What do others think? I would say absolutely. I mean, much of life has happened online in the past year. Okay, if it's okay with everyone, I go back to the presentation for some more tips and strategies. Let me find my toggle bar. Hold on. Okay, so here are a few important tips, whether you're grant writing or applying to a residency program. So this answers some of the questions that were in the chat box, but I think it is good to be clear, concise, and compelling. I wouldn't, if something said a 10,000 character count, I wouldn't do as brief as a 1,000 character count, but if you can say it all in 7,500 characters, great. So in our field, images are really worth more than 1,000 words. It's true. So never forget that your artwork is really the most important aspect of an application. And in some cases on Slide Room, people will not even read some of the written part at first. Like you would have to get past a certain amount with your images to even have that aspect be read. So really good quality images are essential, and really strong visuals that create a lasting impression with the review panels are accessible. I have a little bit of a funny story about that in a second. And then know how to size your digital images to the required format, and be sure that they open properly and are submitted in the requested format. So recently I was doing a print public panel with for a new municipal artist in residency program with the city of Berkeley. And so people on the panel were not artists. They were people who worked in the Department of Health, Housing, and Community Services. And I think one of the artists had like a smiley face or a Post-it note that was like part of the piece of the work sample, which if you're an artist, it wasn't that strange. But for people on the panel who were not an artist, could not understand how like a Post-it note or a smiley face could be a piece of a work sample. So you also want to know who's on your panel and who's going to be looking at your work. So, here's an example of, this was for the Municipal Artist in Residency program, and Laura is one of the artists that was selected, and these are her community portrait pop-ups, which created a strong impression with the same panel I was just talking about. And then we heard earlier from the artist Christine Wong Yap, who's the second of this new Municipal Artist in Residency program with the city of Berkeley. And it's particularly working on COVID recovery, community resilience, and community well-being. And so you can see how her work samples and her public art project in New York City kind of matched the kind of work that the city was looking to do with artists in this case. And so thinking about how your work samples both match your narrative, but also the focus of the application. And this part of the presentation goes back to Lauren Davies. And And so they're CALA Fellowship alumni artists from, almost a decade ago, but I think some of this still holds up, where depending on the scale of your work, it can be really important to help clarify the dimensions to the jury. So this is like a huge wall piece with, with different dimensions. And so having two views can be a helpful tool. Same thing when a really big piece repeats, like having a detail to become more clear and effective can really help. Again, this, shows multiple views that make it clear that there's a video insert that's a part of the piece. So these are all sort of clarifying ways to clarify your image and what you're doing. Installation views can establish a relationship between various images that have been submitted for review. So now we'll talk about the fun part of the presentation of some not so good strategies. So never great to be uninformed. I plan to come to CALA to work on my exciting new glass blowing project. So CALA Art Institute residencies focus on printmaking, some photography, digital media, but we don't have ceramics or glass blowing. So you want to know what you're applying to and make sure you've done the research part of your grant. And then in terms of the work sample, this is like never a good way to go, is look at my amazing array of technical skills or like the range of work that I do. I think this is one of the most common things that can go wrong in an application is presenting inconsistent images. So in this case, presenting 10 inconsistent images created with 10 completely unrelated processes. Like it's very overwhelming when you're looking at someone's work for the first time, you're trying to understand what they've written and you're trying to understand their images. So, please don't mismatch the narrative, images, and budget. The artwork should be strong and compelling, and it should relate specifically to the narrative. And then that narrative needs to relate specifically to the budget. So we shouldn't be learning something about your project in the budget that's not in the narrative. And similarly, you really want your artwork to be in sync with both of those aspects of your application. This is what I bump up against often. Don't leave your application preparation until the last minute. Allow enough time to strategize, write, review, and rethink. And this becomes even more important when you're trying to collaborate with multiple partners. So I was just working on a California Arts Council grant this week, which requires, multiple partners. And I thought somebody was going to partner with us and then found out via text that wasn't the case and then was scrambling today. And I was thinking about this presentation and laughing how I was not following this particular advice, but I think it's really good advice. And this one too, like have somebody else that has second pair of eyes, look at your application. I think when we're working on things, it really helps to have somebody do a little proofreading. Oh, yes. Emily points out that like another reason to do it early is there can be a glitch in the uploading of the website or the submitting, and that does happen too. And the question before from Emma is those two views would be counted as one image. So, often you can put those two images together into one to be included as one image. I've been known to do this mistake as well. Want to alienate professional contacts, ask for a written reference the day before the application deadline, or forget to tell them you've added their name as a reference at all. So again, getting out in front of things is so important, and making sure that when you've asked for the reference, you've done it where you've given them enough time, or you've offered to write a draft, or you've offered, to help in whatever way you can. And please let somebody know if you'd like them to be a reference. And sometimes it's an email or a phone number that they're giving. How much lead time is polite for these questions? Gosh, I would say at least a week, but probably 2 weeks is more polite. I was really surprised that the artist that I was talking about, 2 weeks. Okay. I was really surprised the artist I was talking about gave me over a month. That seemed really a lot of time. So 2 weeks seems great. And here's the question somebody asked in the chat box earlier about whether you could approach somebody who had gotten the grant in advance. So this is the question about, like, let's say you don't get the grant and you don't get the award. Should you follow up with the organization? So after the selections have been announced, don't necessarily call the organization for feedback on your application. I would say that's fair. Most likely you're one of many applicants, but some funders are okay with giving feedback. So email the funder for their policy. I always email and ask if we can get feedback, and I learn each time from the NEA or the CAC, what the panelists thought. And we could submit the same application 3 years in a row and sometimes get funded and sometimes not. So those panels are so different. I mean, a lot of it depends on who your panelists are. So sometimes the feedback helps like improve the application, and sometimes it just happens to be the particular panelists that you got. I mean, I always try to incorporate the feedback. So I always ask. Similarly, if you find out who a guest juror was or a panelist was, don't attempt to contact that person for feedback. They're often invited by the organization to review these applications, so it's better to ask the particular organization for feedback. So, I think we've mentioned this a couple of times, but keep on keeping on. You might not know who was on the review panel. Maybe you weren't selected this time, but a curator or arts administrator might remember you the next time, or they might have seen your work while they were reviewing applications, and they might think of your work for another purpose. That happens quite a bit, actually, where you're just getting more eyes on your work, and it might not be right for this particular project, but could be right for a later project. So we definitely encourage, if you're still interested in the program, the application, getting feedback and reapplying. I'm not saying this is true about these particular artists here, but some artists receive the coveted Pollock Krasner Award after applying multiple times, or the Guggenheim after applying for decades. So, once you have some of these materials together, some of these applications don't take that much time. I mean, you might have to get a letter of reference and update something, but please, if it's important to you, keep after it. So in that case, keep good records on your computer or whatever your record keeping system is, so that you can apply for grants relatively efficiently and learn from what you did in the past and improve upon it in the future. So this is true both in my own art practice and for the organization I work for. Applications are an endless process. Make a committed effort to improve with each application you make. I see a project. Can you apply to different grants for the same project? Absolutely. And it's a really smart way to go. And funders often like to be not the only funder of a project. So somehow the more funding you have for a project, the more people seem to want to fund it, which is kind of counterintuitive. Like, it seems like, oh, they already have a lot of funding, that funder should fund somebody else. But we've found the opposite to be true, that funders feel really good to know that these 3 other people are funding this project. It's going to happen. Our money is only going to improve the impact or deepen the impact. This is just our philosophy, of course, is find a balance, do your best. You can't control the outcome. Don't set yourself up to be emotionally debilitated or disappointed in a way that'll paralyze your future efforts. It's really just a part of the process and a part of the learning process. Everyone gets discouraged. Don't give up. We have great faith in each of you that your projects will be funded. And I'm gonna stop this share for a little bit, just to take a break, and then we'll get back to the artist resources. So I just like to take a break from sharing my screen. Feel free to ask more questions if anything came up, or share an experience that you've had applying for a grant recently, or something that you've bumped up against that we might want to cover. I'm also really interested in the part 2 part of the grant writing for artists, what people might be interested in learning more about or diving deeper into. So if something comes up for you that you want to put in the chat box about that, or talk about that, feel free to unmute yourself for that. These are great. Emily said, it seems like many grants are strictly for projects as opposed to ongoing work. Can you address that? That's been my experience too, is that often artists who want to fund their ongoing work are sometimes better off going the route of artist residencies or applying to exhibit work that they've been creating in their studio or in their own practice. And many of the grants that I'm particularly used to are what we talked about at the beginning as kind of community oriented or have an educational component, have some level of community impact. So I am not as experienced with grants that might be more focused on like a strictly studio practice. Maybe somebody else has put something in the chat about that. My feeling for that is that there's a lot of good like artist residency and fellowship opportunities for that. Did I miss anything? Any other questions that people see? So the question is applying for fellowship similar to a grant? And it's a very, very similar process. Okay. Yeah, so applying for fellowships, often the work sample is even more important than in a grant. I mean, sometimes with a grant, the actual outcome or the community work could be very important, the evaluation. For a fellowship, your work samples and the sort of matching of your artist statement and what you plan to do and how that matches up with the particular artist residency's resources is the most important. Part 2 would be examples of artist narrative and other aspects of the proposal. That's great. Yeah, so feel free to send feedback and we'll kind of try to custom tailor the second part of this that's coming up on March 2nd. So if there aren't too many other questions now, I'll go into the artist resources, and that includes grant opportunities and fellowship and residency opportunities. Oh, hi, Mark. I'm 71 years old and this is all very overwhelming. How do we keep this? I know it can be overwhelming. What do you think about hiring someone to help you write a grant application? I think that's a great idea. I often do these workshops and then people will email me their proposals and I'll do a quick read through because I can't help myself and just send it right back to them with very brief feedback. So I do think it can be overwhelming. It's my dog. But I do think the best thing to do is to pick one that feels the least overwhelming and start it and do it. And it might be easier than you think. The whole talk is being recorded and you can watch it again. Yeah, okay. And then I also think it is possible to hire someone to write a grant application. I've also done that for people and they end up doing most of the work themselves, but it can feel good to go through the process the first couple of times with someone. So I think those are also great ideas. Hi, Lynn. I think you can definitely either do it yourself or hire somebody. You'd be fine either way. So nice to see some people I know. Hey, okay. So I think I'm going to pull up the resources if that's okay, and we'll finish up the last section of this. And at the end, there's my contact info. So I do offer for anyone who wants to email me their artist statement. I'm happy to look at it. Feel free. You'll get my contact info at the end. Okay. Great. It always takes me a second to find the toggle button. Do you guys like my postcard collection? All right, so we're talking about what else is out there. So I saw somebody mention Artadia in the chat box. And this is a nonprofit grant maker and nationwide community of visual artists, curators, and patrons who elevate the careers of artists at pivotal moments in their practice. So this is something we've now seen a couple times from funders. They're very interested in supporting artists at pivotal moments in their practice. So that's something you can think about when you're writing about your practice or your artwork. I'm glad you like the postcards, Mark. Okay. And the Bay Area is one of 6 partnering cities. Houston, Chicago, can't remember the other cities. You'll have to look at the website to see. The next San Francisco application for Artadia is open in June. So I think it's open for the month, due by July 1st, 2021. And recent Bay Area recipients include Mike Henderson, the painter on the left, and Lava Thomas, artist on the right. This is a really good practice grant for people who are in the Bay Area, and it's called the Quick Grant. And it's through the Center for Cultural Innovation. And they provide reimbursement funds to Bay Area nonprofit organizations and individual artists in the state of California for professional development activities. So you apply by the 15th of each month for up to $600 to get reimbursed, and it could cover a workshop. You know, it used to be able to cover a conference, work with consultants or coaches, mentors in order to build administrative capacity, hone your business skills, and strengthen the financial sustainability of an organization, art practice, or area of cultural production. And I think I've also read for now that some of this can be like COVID related, like if you need help putting something online, that there's that element of it now. And so, you know, you could just try this by February 15th if you have something coming up, and see how it works out. It's not a very cumbersome application. And then the bigger grants they do are called Investing in Artists grants, and they're offering 3 more rounds of funding, 2021 through 2023, in what they call their Investing in Artists program for Bay Area performing arts and media arts. So May 2021 is the next deadline. So some people are really good at calendaring out all of these deadlines, putting them on your Google Calendar, and you know, so they pop up and you're prepared for them. This particular grant is for investing in artists, and it's designed to support diverse working artists in the Bay Area in performing arts and media arts. So dance, music, musical theater, opera, theater, video, film, animation. Applicants representing a wide range of cultural expressions and artistic practices are encouraged to apply. I wonder if many of these, this is particularly for photographers, some of them are for other visual arts as well, like San Francisco Arts Commission or Puffin Foundation. I'm sure that photographers have a much more comprehensive list than this. I had mentioned Creative Capital, which is not just for photographers, is a site that I like to look at. I always think that residency program at Lightwork looks amazing. I'm curious about Getty Images editorial grant. I've applied for the Puffin Foundation before and never gotten it. So these are just some examples of potential links. More artist opportunities. Sites that I really think are worth a visit are the Alliance of Artist Communities, is a comprehensive site looking at artist residencies, you know, across the country and maybe even around the globe. I think it's international as well. I highly recommend this artist community residency site. I was just at work looking through it, and at one day in like 2018, and I saw the Rauschenberg residency program has a 2-week residency for full-time arts administrators whose organization is a part of the Alliance of Artist Communities, you know, apply in a week. And I was only one of like 40 people who applied for this amazing residency, the Rausch in Captiva, Florida. And I was able to go down there for 2 weeks with 10 other arts administrators who are full-time artists, and just have access to, you know, ceramics and printmaking and welding, and I mean, anything you could ask for was there. And I found it on the Alliance of Artists Community site just when I was kind of scrolling through and visiting. So I really highly recommend that site for artist residencies. I talked about creative capital a few times. After this slide, I'll talk a lot more about the opportunities at Kala Art Institute, which is in Berkeley, where I work. I recently was part of a panel for the City of Emeryville Bus Shelter Public Art Project, and this is why I was mentioning it's always worth checking in with the city you live to see what kind of projects they have. So if you're a resident of the City of Emeryville, they have this amazing bus shelter public art project where they pay artists $4,000 to take images that they already have made and size them and put them in 4 bus shelters in Emeryville. So it's a really cool project. It was not a highly, it wasn't super, super competitive. There was probably like 8 artists selected for 40 applicants. And each of those 8 artists received $4,000. So I thought this is a great example of a project I might not have known about that a city's running. So I'd really check with your city sites to see what their cultural funding looks like. And then I like to check with the Sustainable Arts Foundation, and that's for people who are parents. It's a great resource if you're a parent artist. And they both do individual awards for parents. So you have to have an 18-year-old at home with you. And they also do awards for artist residency programs to offer parent artists residencies. So that's another site that I would go to each year for myself personally and see, oh, is there a short residency, like a week or 2 weeks, something that I could do. And, because a lot of times artist residencies are just too long away for me, like a month might be too long, but a week-long residency is perfect, or a 2-week-long residency. So I really recommend the Sustainable Arts Foundation as well. And now I get to talk about where I work. So for those of you who are not familiar with Kala Art Institute, we are an international artist residency program rooted in our local community. So we're located in West Berkeley in the old Heinz Ketchup Factory building, right where Emeryville, Oakland, and Berkeley come together. And so we have a lot of programming that serves the local community, but we also have artists who come for residencies from across the country and around the world. We're probably best known for our printmaking facilities. I think Erica mentioned we have a black and white dark room. We also have a 4x5 camera, other equipment you can check out, lighting room, green screens, big media lab with an Imicon scanner, a couple scanners, 3 large scale digital media, digital printers, large scale digital printers. Anyway, Sonia's been an AIR. She might say more about it. So lots of shared equipment, and you can apply, usually it's a little bit different during the pandemic, to 3 or 4 deadlines a year to become an artist in residence. We do not provide housing at this point. It's something that we'd like to do in the near future, is partner with one of those condos that's been going up in our neighborhood to see if we can get some kind of subsidized artist housing going as well. So you can apply to be an artist in residence. You get 24/7 access. And usually the contract is a month long, and then you can extend it over time. So some people will stay a month, some people have been there 30 years. So it's sort of an extended community. And then in addition to the artist in residency program, we have the fellowship residency program and special sort of fellowships, which basically means that you receive a longer residency up to 6 months. You receive some kind of financial stipend. In the case of the fellowship residency program, you receive $3,000. The same kind of technical support and access to the equipment as the artist in residency program. And then as your cohort, you also have a culminating exhibition in the Kala Gallery. So on Heinz Avenue in the old Heinz Ketchup Factory are the artist in residency studios, and then around the corner in San Pablo is a public facing gallery. So where the artwork that's made at Kala can sort of be shown and spark conversation with the community. And that application deadline, I want to say, is usually May. So I would suggest start checking the website if you're interested in that around March. And for the past maybe 4 or 5 years, we've had a media arts residency program that's basically modeled after the fellowship residency program. It turns out that the NEA was able to fund an artist community section, and then had a separate funding for media arts, which is how we began to do the media arts residency program, and have kept it going. And so it's for artists working in and across film, video, animation. We've had people do VR, installation, performance, and things like that. And we had a really similar model where a 6-month residency, $3,000, and a culminating exhibition with your other media arts fellows. So that deadline will be the same time as the fellowship residency program. So start looking in March for that. And then I mentioned the Sustainable Arts Foundation, which is particularly for parent artists. And I want to say for the past 7 or 8 years, they've funded CALA's parent artist residency at CALA. And so what we have done is sort of $1,000 of custom tailored services for parents. And originally the idea was that a parent might want to send their kid to Camp CALA in the summer and at the same time work in the studio. So maybe they have a two-week residency, their kids at Camp CALA for 2 weeks, and they can kind of pick and choose how they use CALA's resources. This year, for the first time, we have one of our fellowship spots designated for a parent artist. So that's something else worth checking out. Same deadlines, probably May. Start checking the website in March. And so those are most of CALA's residencies that we have. Sometimes things come up, like I mentioned, Print Public, which is our public art residency, and that's for artists doing temporary art installations along San Pablo Avenue in CALA's neighborhood. And then we just started a brand new municipal artist in residency program with the city of Berkeley. So we're always willing to try out new ideas, new partnerships, and new residencies. And there's a number of arts organizations like us doing very similar work. And that's where I suggested the Alliance of Artists Communities website. And, you know, you can find really some amazing organizations that way. And then finally, I'm just giving you all my contact information, and I really want to encourage each of you to apply for a couple of grants. Email me if you have any questions, and to start exploring all of these amazing links and start funding those great projects that I'm sure you're all working on. So let me just stop the share. And really want to say thank you so much for everyone. I'll stick around for 5 or 10 minutes to answer questions if you have questions. I really hope that there is some helpful information in there for all of you. And I'm really excited to see the projects that some of you are working on, and hope that there is a link or two that will get you further down the path you need to go. And really thanks to the new people I'm meeting and to some friends I see who showed up tonight too. It's really sweet. And feel free to stay and ask questions. I mean, I'm technically here for 10 or 15 more minutes. Or if you're hungry and need to go, I totally understand too.
Hey, Ellen, I'm not trying to oversell your Part 2 workshop because it's very affordable and it's only $10. Only 20 people get to join. We're really just charging for some accountability to make sure people come. But can you kind of talk about what you're going to go into, how it's different than tonight's presentation?
Yeah, I've done the Part 2 a couple of different ways. So it's still a little bit open-ended, but what we've done in the past is look at, with some artist permission, successful applications to some of CALA's programming, which I think was really helpful. So we've looked at some successful work samples and how they match up with their narratives. And I've shared some personal grants that I've written and maybe successfully gotten or not successfully gotten, to kind of go over the different stages in a concrete way. So I don't think the second one will be recorded, if that's okay. So I think you'd have to be there in person because it's some sharing of more people's personal processes and stuff, which I have permission to do, but I'm not sure I have permission to record them. Does that sound okay?
I found that really helpful, was to actually see, because I think a lot of our audience is curious, like, can I actually look at somebody's grant? There was that question earlier about reaching out to other artists. And for me, that was really helpful, just to see how well organized it was, how each heading was titled. And it was really helpful for me to see
Yeah.
other people's grants.
Yeah, I like that part a lot too. And it'll be nice. I mean, it's, you know, a chance I have to reach out and collect samples and get permission. But it is a really concrete way to sort of be like, oh yes, these are things to do, or things to avoid. And so in that way, I think part two will be really helpful, and there'll be less people. So it'll be an element that's more interactive as well.
That's helped me move on to write grants for City College too. So all of these tips and techniques, even if whether you're an individual artist or you work for a nonprofit, they're all really helpful techniques. So
Yeah, and I actually I'm not on that many panels, but this year I've been on the other side of it a couple more times, which is another helpful perspective to see what it feels like to go through 50 applications and what pops and what's kind of a red flag, you know. And so that's another interesting perspective to offer. And it's really helpful for me, who I do apply for a certain number of things for myself, and then I apply for a ton of things for CALA. And so there's some really good reminders when I was able to be on the other side of being a panelist. So another thing people can do is, it might be too late for this year, but the California Arts Council, which is one of our case studies, often has open calls for panelists. And so that's another way to sort of get behind the scenes, be somebody who's making the decisions about who's getting funded, and see how those panel discussions and panel reviews go.
it's
I think
very
that can be.
helpful. I've been on several grants committees for my peers for awards, usually in the $1,000 to $5,000 range. And the ones that stand out, like you said, ones that show 1 to 2 bodies of work very strong, have very clear goals as to what they're going to use the funds for, how they'll share it back, and have a very focused artist statement. So it really helps. It really helps to be on those panels and to see. And
I agree. And it was so interesting being on a panel with people who weren't artists, like that wasn't their field. That was also very eye-opening to me. There was like a lot of overlap, and then some really different feelings about like what art should be and what artists should be doing.
I think it's okay to assume that you have to take people by the hand from scratch. I mean, would you agree? Because
I would absolutely agree. A lot of times too, for CALA, when you're applying through like the NEA, or sort of, you know, where panelists are coming from all different parts of the country, you can't make assumptions about what you think people are like or doing in the Bay Area. And I suppose that's true for the Bay Area itself as well.
And disciplines too, because there's so many interdisciplines. You can't assume that because you're applying to CALA, everybody's or somewhere else, everybody is a photo expert.
Yeah.
Especially if you have a jury of different types of panelists, which we often do. We find it's really great to incorporate people from different backgrounds.
I agree. Now, there's still a lot of people on here. I'm totally open to any more questions that come up. Erica, I love that you like are such a grant writer now. It's great. Do you have more to jump in and add then?
Let's see. Well, if you want, I can dig up one of my case studies if you need more. I've written a lot of failed grants too. You know, that is true about, and you know, we're thinking about getting a panel of Guggenheim artists together and just talking about how they did it. And many of them, you know, did it 10 to 15 times before they got the award. And so I think it's just like auditioning for The Voice, right? You have to do it many, many times. Like, don't be embarrassed. And some years there are particular themes that fit really well with the work that you're doing already. And sometimes you can kind of tailor your artist statement to modify your project to fit into the theme. And Harvey has a great question. Do grantors set boundaries in regards to projects that are partly international?
Oh, that is a really good question. You know, we have all of these like regional guidelines now, and then the past year it's been like, oh, I'm Bay Area based and I'm living in Houston. Oh, I'm doing this project in North Oakland and I'm living in Japan. And so all of a sudden you've seen these geographic boundaries really expand, but I don't know that that will last. Have you all noticed that as well? Like we have somebody who's doing like work in North Oakland who's literally in Japan for the year.
Well, I think COVID has opened up a lot of those questions of people working nationally and internationally. And I've seen a lot of virtual artist residencies, which have opened up interesting opportunities since people aren't leaving their homes to participate in ways maybe they haven't before.
I've been curious about that. We have our first 1 or 2 virtual artists in residence at COLA, and it's really interesting because it seems like if you have a really good studio setup or a really good practice in place, that would work. But for those of us who go to residencies to tap into equipment, resources, then I'm having a little bit of trouble seeing how the virtual artist residency would help somebody like me. I don't know.
I think there was a big sharing component, a big presentation component. No, I agree. It's not ideal, right? But it's interesting that to see if this virtual space that we've kind of been forced into will continue in some forums. I know that at Camerawork, we like the virtual space as a way to kind of, invite different audiences. And it'll be interesting to see if that continues in the artist residency format.
I'm curious if anyone who's still here is not from the Bay Area or not from California, and if these tips and these resources felt relevant. Okay, great.
Yes. And where are you from? Yes. Chicago, awesome. Somebody stayed up later.
I feel like we all of a sudden have a lot of Chicago people in the Bay Area who are sort of coming in to work at the Headlands and the Berkeley Art Museum, Pacific Film Archives. I feel like there's a lot of Chicago energy coming to the Bay Area.
Yeah, I mean, Harvey's got another great question. He's working internationally in Cuba, and he's wondering if political issues affect particular grants.
They do. We've had issues in the past through COLA with Iranian artists who've been awarded fellowships, and then the NEA was not able to direct the money directly towards those artists, and we've had to make adjustments. And we've, of course, they've still had their residency, but that does come up sometimes.
You have to read the small print. I know some professional development grants I've applied for don't allow me to go to Texas, for example, because of their conservative views on gay marriage and gay rights, and it's funded by San Francisco. So I would say yes, that comes up sometimes.
Wow,
how do
great.
virtual artist residencies work? What's the benefit? You'll have to check it out. You can, I mean, Ellen just said she didn't think it'd be useful to her, but I've seen people do them. It's some people.
I could see how it would work out for people, in particular, if you're somebody who needs that external structure of, like you said, maybe you have a cohort that you're with, and maybe you have virtual studio visits that you do. I recently was on a call with somebody from, is it Joan Mitchell residency that's in New Orleans, and they just did a couple rounds of a virtual artist residency, and they said people did enjoy the virtual studio visit aspect of it.
Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting tools out there and cameras where people can take you through their studio space, and I think for the artists, it's like Ellen said, that accountability piece is really, and the opportunity to present and share your work and process is still there. And
so I am going to say, I don't know if you want to speak, Sonia, but Sonia, who's here, has done so many artist residencies, and you probably have a lot of valuable things to add. about applying for artist residencies, as somebody who's done just about as many as anybody I know.
I also think some organizations need to keep supporting artists and want to keep supporting artists, and artists need to keep their CVs going. And so, you know, in a lot of ways it's better than nothing. And we've had to get really creative about it. But yeah, Sonia, did you want to turn your mic on and say something?
It should be on. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, to me, I have done a lot of artist residencies, and to me personally, it's really about space and getting to another place, because most of my work actually relates to where I'm going. So it's kind of specific usually. So to me, like the whole idea of virtual artist residencies, I can't see, because I would still be here and I don't really have a studio in the Bay Area, and I would still be kind of like having to go about all my daily routines and all my daily stuff and not be out of here. And, you know, so I don't really, I mean, what I could see is that interaction with other artists, like maybe sort of like more like a critique seminar or something like that. Maybe that's what it's good for, or how it could be helpful. I mean, surely, I'm sure it's better than nothing, but I've kind of not applied to places. I'm starting to apply now because it seems like some are reopening or have sort of a schedule to maybe reopen in summer. But before that, I just didn't apply. But most places didn't even take any applications, to be honest.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, the residency that I went on that was all arts administrators, when we met recently, I was very surprised that a number of the artist residency programs have been closed since last March.
Yep.
And it makes sense health-wise and COVID-wise, and especially if people are traveling from all over to become a cohort for 1 month together in a space. I understand why the places have had to cancel and that kind of thing. But it just pains me, all of that unused equipment and space just being there for, you know, close to a year now.
Yeah, also some programs like adjusted. I actually just got an artist residency up in Healdsburg. It's called Chalk Hill, and they are now just having one artist at a time instead of usually like, I don't know, 4 or 5. So of course that makes it even more competitive, because they can take less artists than before. But I was so glad to get it, because I'm like, I want to get out of the city for the whole COVID thing. It's just so great to do that. But in others I have heard have adjusted, like Anderson Ranch, for instance. I heard that now they have, like, it's usually a very community oriented artist residency with lots of people and shared studios and shared bathrooms and stuff like that. So now apparently they have like scaled it down to less people, and everybody has like their own little stove in their room or their cooking plate or something, and they don't have any more cafeteria, which was kind of like the gathering place. It was like the center of the residency. It's like, to me, it sounded so sad. I was like, I'm so glad I went there before all of this happened.
I've seen a lot of in-person residencies still going too. And you're right, they've just kind of turned it into a more social distancing, private experience with less people. But again, just to keep that opportunity going is so important. And soon, very soon, we'll all be together again. Are there any other questions? Ellen, thank you so much for joining us tonight and sharing your years of experience. Again, you know, there's lots of links here, and Christina and Sunny will be sending everybody who registered for tonight a link to the materials, including, you're willing to share the slide deck. Is that right, Ellen? That's very kind. You've always been generous like that. And if you would like to sign up for her workshop, you should do that now because space is limited. That will be on Tuesday, March 2nd at 6 o'clock. And if you would like to support more programming like these, as well as artists in your community, we really hope that you will consider becoming a San Francisco Camerawork member if you're not already. You will get invited also to members only events. And I just wanted to say thank you again. We hope you'll visit our website and consider joining us at our next artist talk, which is a conversation between Michael Owuna, who was one of the top artists in our 2020 auction. His piece was bid on several times, and he'll be in conversation with professor and artist Jonathan Kalm from Stanford University. And we're looking very forward to hearing more about their work and their insights about the black body is Michael Owuna's work. So take a look at our website and see the events that are coming up. We hope you'll join us. And I'll hand it over to Christina.
Thank you so much, Erica. And thank you again, Ellen. That was incredibly informative and I learned a lot today. Like Erica already mentioned, we'll be sending around a recording of tonight's presentation and all the links. So I know we were trying to get them in the chat for you guys, but they'll also be available after tonight's session as well. So thank you again for being here. It's always really nice to see so many familiar faces and so many familiar names on the Zoom screen and new names and new faces. So thank you for being here and looking forward to see you next month for part 2 and for some of our other upcoming events this month that Erica already mentioned. But thank you again. This has been really wonderful.
Thanks for having me. And Harvey, yes, is scheduled. Harvey said he's coming to the next workshop, and can he email me questions? Yes. Thanks so much for having me.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much.